Well, welcome, Kathleen. Welcome once again to Women's Spaces. And I understand that there's a recent book that you've written called Unmaking War, Remaking Men. I have to say the title again, Unmaking War, Remaking Men. That is just a phenomenal title. Can you go into a little bit about the book, what it's about? Just share a little bit with us.
You know, I'd like to start maybe by talking about how the book started for me, because I didn't have in mind writing a book about war, about masculinity in war, until I was watching news coverage of one of the several wars going on in the world right now, and realized that the people who were being killed by the soldiers were being referred to as innocent lives. And so the reports would talk about the loss of so many innocent lives today in this particular area. If it's U.S. soldiers doing the killing, those innocent lives are referred to as collateral damage, to make us move a little further away from the reality of lives being taken during war. But that term, innocent lives, even collateral damage, got under my skin in the sense that it immediately became clear to me that as soon as you identify one group of people who are not to be killed during war, theoretically at least, you have immediately, by the very language, identified another group of people who can be killed, and they are, of course, soldiers in combat. And that's where I had to begin and turn my attention as I began writing this book.
Well, very interesting that you say that, as if it's okay, what you're saying, it's okay to kill one body of people, but it's not okay to kill another body. I mean, that's really interesting psychology that we have in our culture, don't you think?
It's an interesting psychology, and worse, it's a really incredible statement about what we think of as civilized. That as civilized states and nations in this world, we still hold groups of people who are available to be killed. And that all the language around sending soldiers off to combat, and all the thanking them for their service, and all the honoring, this is what Veterans Day is all about, the honoring that is being done so as to put a gloss over the fact that these are all lives being put in imminent risk.
And what's also so interesting is their lives are at risk. I mean, that we don't even want to show the caskets that come back from the war, as if nobody's really getting killed, or if whoever we're killing, it's okay. For you as an author and a feminist activist, what is the connection, or is there a connection between your first book, Female Sexual Slavery, and Unmaking War, Remaking Men?
I finally figured that out myself by the time I finished writing it. And that was the realization that what I was going after in Female Sexual Slavery was an invisible, horrendous crime against women, but invisible, a trafficking in women, a use of women to be purchased, to be used for sex, to be trafficked from one place to another, and invisible. Accepted, prostitution being accepted, being referred to as the oldest profession, the trafficking not even being acknowledged in our society, in any countries, or by the United Nations. When I interviewed at the Human Rights Commission there, I was told, oh, that's something that happened a long time ago. But I had the documentation, the facts, but more importantly, I had to get into the women's experiences to find out what it is that you're experiencing when you go through that. And at that moment, I have to engage my own empathy. It's no longer a matter of simply putting together the material. It's putting yourself in their shoes and saying, how would you feel if you were being put through this experience? That brings a passion for change into your work, into your writing. And that's the same thing I found when I was writing Unmaking War, Remaking Men. That I needed to not only get into the soldiers' experiences, combat being very far removed from my own life, but then there's the next group of invisible victims, and that's the people who are killed, who are harmed, whose villages are destroyed, whose lives are ruined by combat and by living in war zones. People that we tend to distance ourselves from, our media tends to keep us away from, so that we won't really come close into thinking about the damages that we're doing to people in other parts of the world. And we're not going to ever get world peace until we face up to that reality, look at it, take it on board, and experience that empathy.
Well, it reminds me when, we're both sociologists, so to speak, and they always talk about the other. So it's okay, the other's the bad guy, the other's whatever's going on. And here we're talking about the other is actually us and all those around us, and how we're relating to war, how we're understanding it, and where is our empathy. I mean, it's a very point. You were going to say something?
I think you just made a very important point. We tend to think about the other, for example, the other Afghans, the other Iraqis,
exactly,
the other people that are being killed, but we have othered ourselves into a distancing and a disengagement from their realities. And in doing so, our government, our military, and our soldiers then just move forward with impunity. And it's that impunity that we need to break down.
Well, it's also interesting, too, that maybe we have to start looking at having more compassion and more empathy for whoever we consider the other, whether it's our soldiers, whether it's our so-called enemies, whatever. I mean, it's a very, very important point. I'd like to ask you one last question here. You talk about in Unmaking War and Remaking Men that it's important to become an activist, to take action. How do you go from empathy to activism, or even compassion to activism? What are some suggestions you might have?
I think empathy itself is its own source of activism, because once we begin to not only think about what another has experienced, but take on the feeling and the meaning of that experience, it builds in us a motivation for change. It builds in us an intolerance for what's going on out there. So in my book, I went from the presentation of what's actually happening in war that we don't see on the television, and what has happened to soldiers going into combat, to how we can get out of this, from global programs that we have the capacity to put into place for making world peace, to our own individual activism, which we really must engage. And for that, I'm taking my own activism, the programs that I'm offering now for making change. One of them is called Making Change. It's about creating us as change agents and using that very power of empathy, the very force that comes from being empathetic. Empathy makes us want to save another human's life, not to change it, to take it away, and to use that toward making change. I'm also looking at how we can, through our writing, become more empathetic, and how empathy can actually be a force for thinking and writing. And so I'm offering a program called Thinking Through Writing, as well as courses on from global action to empathy and activism.
Well, it reminds me I'd like to tell you just a quick story. One day I was sitting in my kitchen and I was eating dinner with my husband, and all of a sudden I thought to myself, what would it be like to all of a sudden have a bomb come through the kitchen? And it just startled me. And I thought, oh my God, it was like I started thinking of these women and these children. And I think that's what you're talking about.
Yes.
Getting in touch.
Getting in touch with it and galvanizing it toward an action. When we act from that very place that you have just described so well, that's when we are most convincing and most urgent in our demands.
Well, I want to thank you so much for writing this wonderful book. I think the whole world should read it, and I want to thank you for being on Women's Spaces and wishing you all the luck with this new project, the new project you have with the classes and the courses that you're going to be offering.
Thank you.